Some men choose loneliness because it's easier than risking their heart again. Ezra McCade was one of those men. For 15 years, he lived alone in the Wyoming mountains, far from town, far from people, far from the pain that comes with letting someone in. He turned away every woman who tried. He trusted his silence more than any promise, his solitude more than any companion. Then, one autumn day, a woman walked into his camp and refused to leave. She didn't beg or cry. She just looked him in the eye and said 6 words that changed everything. What could make a man who chose loneliness for 15 years finally open his heart? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning air bit cold against Ezra McCade's face as he stepped out of his cabin into the pale dawn. October in the Wyoming mountains came with a particular kind of silence, the sort that settled deep in a man's bones and reminded him he was alone. He preferred it that way, had for 15 years now. He stretched his shoulders and looked out over the valley below, where pine trees stood like dark sentinels against the first light. His breath came out in small clouds. Winter would arrive early this year. He could feel it in the wind that came down from the peaks, could see it in the way the elk had already started their migration to lower ground. A man learned to read such signs when his life depended on it. Ezra walked to the woodpile and selected 3 logs for the stove. His cabin sat tucked into a natural hollow on the mountainside, hidden from any trail a casual traveler might use. He'd built it himself 13 years back, after 2 years of sleeping in a canvas tent and deciding he wasn't quite ready to die of exposure. The structure was simple: 1 room with a stone fireplace, a sleeping area curtained off with deer hide, shelves for supplies, and a table he'd planed from a single piece of pine. No decoration except what function demanded. No softness anywhere. That was how he wanted it. Inside, he stirred the coals in the stove and added kindling, then the logs. The fire caught quickly. He'd done this same routine so many times he could do it in his sleep, probably had, on some of the colder nights. Coffee next. He ground the beans with more care than most men would bother with. Small pleasures mattered when you lived alone. A man could go mad without them. While the coffee boiled, Ezra pulled his hunting knife from its sheath and ran his thumb along the edge. Still sharp. He'd honed it just 2 days ago. The knife had been with him since before the handle was elk horn, worn smooth by years of use, and if you looked close, you could see initials carved into it, E.M+A. He'd done that carving 20 years ago, when he'd still been young enough to believe forever meant something. He put the knife away without looking at the letters. The coffee finished, and he poured himself a cup, standing by the window to drink it. Below, a red-tailed hawk circled over the valley, hunting. Ezra watched it dive and come up empty, then circle again. Persistence. That's what survival took up here. That, and the ability to be alone without going crazy from it. Most men couldn't do it. He'd seen trappers come up into these mountains, full of grand ideas about independence and freedom, only to head back down after one hard winter, half-starved and talking to themselves. Some didn't make it back at all. The mountains didn't care about your grand ideas. Ezra had learned. He finished his coffee and set about his morning work. The traps needed checking. He had a line running about 3 miles through the best beaver territory. After that, he'd hunt. The deer were moving to their winter grounds, and he needed to fill his smokehouse before the first real snow hit. Then there was the leak in the cabin's north corner that wanted patching, and he was running low on rendered fat for the lamps. Always something that needed doing. That was the blessing of this life. A man's hands stayed busy, and his mind didn't have time to wander where it shouldn't. By mid-morning, he'd collected 2 beavers from his traps and spotted sign of a good-sized buck about a mile from the cabin. He'd come back for it tomorrow. Today was Town Day, his monthly trip to Cutter's Ridge for supplies he couldn't make or trap himself. Salt, coffee, flour, ammunition. The things that kept a man alive through a mountain winter. He hated town days. But he hated dying of scurvy more, so once a month he made the trip. Ezra loaded his pack mule with the beaver pelts and a dozen other furs he'd accumulated over the past weeks. Good quality, all of them. Whatever else people might say about him, they couldn't claim he didn't know his trade. He'd been trapping these mountains since he was 16 years old. He knew where the animals ran, where they denned, how they moved with the seasons. That knowledge had kept him alive and made him enough money that he didn't have to depend on anyone. The trail down to Cutter's Ridge took 4 hours at a steady pace. Ezra knew every turn, every washout, every place where the path narrowed to nothing, and you had to trust your mule's footing. He'd walked it so many times he could probably do it blind. Halfway down, he passed the old Mercer place, or what was left of it. The cabin had collapsed 2 winters back, and now it was just a pile of rotting logs being slowly reclaimed by the forest. The Mercers had given up after 5 years, packed up their children and headed back east to Street. Louis. Too hard, missus, Mercer had said when they'd stopped by his cabin to say goodbye. Too lonely. Ezra hadn't argued with her. She was right. It was both those things. Cutter's Ridge came into view just after noon, a scatter of wooden buildings along both sides of a wide dirt road. The town had grown some since he'd first come through as a young man. There was a proper church now, and a schoolhouse, and the mercantile had expanded to twice its original size. Progress, people called it. Ezra called it crowding. He led his mule down the main street, aware of eyes tracking him from windows and doorways. The ghost of the peaks. That's what they called him when they thought he couldn't hear. The hermit. The wild man. Some of the newer residents didn't even know his name, just that he came down once a month with furs and left with supplies and didn't talk to anyone unless he had to. That suited him fine. The trading post was run by a man named Carson, who'd been fair in his dealings for as long as Ezra had known him. They conducted their business with few words, Carson inspecting the furs, Ezra nodding at the offered prices, money changing hands. Respectful, the way men who understood each other operated. Good quality as always, Carson said, running his hand over a beaver pelt. You'll winter well with this. Plan 2, Ezra replied. Storm coming in tonight, Carson added. Might want to get your supplies and head back before it hits. Ezra nodded. He'd already smelled the snow on the wind. He was loading flour and coffee into his packs when he heard the voice behind him. Mr. McCade. He turned. Mrs. Calloway stood there, the boarding house owner, a widow in her 50s with kind eyes and a manner that wouldn't take no for an answer. She'd tried to mother him the first few times he'd come to town, but he'd made it clear he didn't need mothering. They'd settled into a polite distance since then. Mrs. Calloway, he said. My niece is visiting from Denver, she said. Lovely girl. About your age. I'm having a small dinner tomorrow evening, and I thought, no. Thank you, Ezra said, not unkindly but firmly. I appreciate the thought. Mr. McCade, you can't spend your whole life alone in those mountains. Can and do, ma'am. She sighed, but there was no real disappointment in it. They'd had this conversation before, in various forms. Well, the offer stands. You're always welcome. Appreciated. She left, and Ezra finished loading his supplies. He'd had this same conversation, or some version of it, at least a dozen times over the years. Well-meaning women who thought a man needed fixing, who couldn't understand that some things, once broken, didn't mend. They meant well. He knew that. But meaning well didn't change facts. He led his mule back toward the mountain trail as the first snowflakes started to fall. Big, lazy flakes that caught in his beard and melted against his skin. By the time he reached the cabin, there'd be 2 inches on the ground. By morning, maybe 6. He didn't mind. Snow meant privacy, meant no one would be coming up the mountain to bother him, meant he could settle in for the winter with his traps and his work and his silence. The climb back took longer than the descent, as it always did. The mule plodded steadily under its load, and Ezra walked beside it, watching the snow begin to stick to the pine branches, beautiful in its way, harsh and beautiful, like everything in these mountains. By the time he reached his cabin, the sun was setting behind the western peaks, turning the snow pink and gold. He unloaded the mule, stored his supplies, and started a fire in the stove. Then he sat at his table with a cup of coffee and watched night fall through the window. This was his life, this quiet, this solitude, this careful distance from everything that could hurt him. He'd chosen it, and he'd chosen it for good reasons. Better to be alone than broken again, he thought. Better to have silence than risk your heart. He pulled out his hunting knife and looked at the initials carved in the handle. E.M. plus A. Anna. Her name was Anna, and she'd been dead for 15 years, and he still couldn't quite believe she was gone. But she was, and he was here. And that's how it would stay. He put the knife away and went to bed, listening to the wind pick up outside and the snow fall soft against the roof. Tomorrow he'd check the traps again, hunt that buck, patch the roof, keep living this life he'd built, one day at a time, alone in the mountains where nothing could touch him, where he was safe. Ezra woke to the sound of his mule braying. That wasn't normal. The animal was steady, not given to noise without cause. Ezra was on his feet and reaching for his rifle before he was fully awake, moving on instinct, honed by years of mountain living where hesitation could get you killed. He moved to the window and looked out into the grey morning light. The snow had stopped sometime during the night, leaving everything covered in fresh white. 8 inches, maybe 9. And there, standing next to his mule's shelter, was a woman. Ezra blinked, certain he was seeing things. Women didn't just appear at his camp. Women didn't travel alone in these mountains. Women. She turned and looked directly at the cabin, as if she'd known he was watching. He grabbed his coat and stepped outside, rifle in hand but pointed at the ground, not threatening but ready. A man learned caution up here. "You lost?" he called out. "No," she said. Her voice was clear, steady, no fear in it. "I'm exactly where I meant to be." Ezra walked closer, studying her. She was maybe 30, with dark hair pulled back in a practical braid and grey eyes that met his without flinching. She wore a travelling dress that had seen better days, mud-stained and torn at the hem, and a wool coat that wasn't nearly warm enough for mountain weather. At her feet sat a worn leather satchel, the kind that carried everything a person owned. "This is private property," Ezra said. "I know. I was told in town that Ezra McCade lived up here." She paused. "That's you, isn't it? What do you want?" "Shelter. My wagon broke an axle 2 miles down the trail. My guide left me." She said it matter-of-factly, no self-pity. "I walked through the night to find your cabin." Ezra's jaw tightened. "Your guide left you? In a snowstorm?" "I didn't pay him enough to risk his life, apparently." A slight smile touched her lips, dry humor in the face of a bad situation. "He took one of the horses and the money I had left. Said I should have listened when he told me not to come up here. He was right." "Perhaps." She tilted her head, studying him the way he was studying her. "But I'm here now, and I need help. The wagon is stuck in snow up to the axles. I have supplies in it, food, blankets, things I can't afford to lose. You can walk back to Cutter's Ridge. It's only 4 hours. In this snow. With the trail covered." She shook her head. "I barely made it here. I won't make it back down." Ezra wanted to argue, but she was right. The trail was treacherous even in good conditions. After a snowfall like this, attempting it alone and unprepared would be suicide. He looked at her again, taking in the exhaustion around her eyes, the way she held herself upright through sheer will. "Damn it. Storm's coming," he said gruffly. "Bigger than last night. You can stay until it passes, then I'll take you down. Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," he gestured toward the cabin. "Inside, you're half frozen." She picked up her satchel and followed him. He was aware of her presence behind him, aware that in 15 years he hadn't had another person inside his cabin. It felt like a violation of something sacred, letting the outside world into this space he'd built for himself. Inside, she stood by the door while he added wood to the stove. He could feel her looking around, taking in the sparse room, the lack of anything personal or soft. What did she see? A hermit's cave? A prison? He didn't care what she thought. "Coffee?" he asked, because hospitality was bred into him from childhood, no matter how long he'd been alone. "Please." He poured 2 cups and handed her one. She wrapped her hands around it, and he noticed they were red and chapped from the cold. No gloves. What kind of fool came into the mountains without proper gloves? "You got a name?" he asked. "Claire. Claire Hartwell." "Where you from, Claire Hartwell?" "Street Louis." She took a sip of coffee, closed her eyes briefly in appreciation. "Originally. Long way from home. It's not my home anymore." Something in her voice suggested she didn't want to talk about it, which suited Ezra fine. He didn't want to know her story, didn't want to know anything about her except when she was leaving. They stood in awkward silence. Ezra wasn't used to making conversation, wasn't sure he remembered how. "You should sit," he finally said, gesturing to one of the 2 chairs at his table. "Rest. I'll make something to eat." "I can help." "Sit." She sat. He could feel her watching him as he moved around the small space, pulling out cornmeal and salt pork, starting the pan heating. His movements were efficient, practiced. A man who'd cooked for himself for 15 years learned to do it without fuss. "You live here alone?" Claire asked. "Yes." "By choice?" "Yes." "That must be—" She paused, searching for the right word. "Peaceful." "It is." She didn't push further, which he appreciated. Most people couldn't stand silence, felt the need to fill it with chatter. Claire seemed comfortable with quiet. She sipped her coffee and looked out the window at the snow-covered valley, and something about the way she held herself reminded him of someone settling into a place they belonged. He didn't like that. Breakfast was simple cornmeal mush and fried salt pork. She ate without complaint, and he noticed she had good manners despite the obvious hunger. Refined upbringing, then. What was a woman with refined upbringing doing alone in the Wyoming mountains? Not his business, he reminded himself. After breakfast, he showed her where she could wash up a basin of water he warmed on the stove. She was efficient about it, no fussing or demanding privacy, just cleaned her hands and face and thanked him quietly. "The wagon," she said. "I should go back for my things before the next storm hits." "We'll go together," Ezra said. "After this storm passes. Could be 2 days, could be 3. Her face fell slightly, but she nodded. "I understand. I'm sorry to impose on you." "Already imposed. Might as well do it right." He caught the ghost of a smile on her face before she turned away. The day passed slowly. Ezra tried to go about his normal routine, but everything felt off with Claire there. He worked on mending a trap while she sat by the window, reading a book she'd pulled from her satchel. Sometimes he caught her looking at him, quickly glancing away when their eyes met. By afternoon, his hand was bleeding. He'd been distracted, not paying attention, and the knife had slipped. Just a shallow cut across his palm, nothing serious, but it bled freely. "Let me see that," Claire said, standing up. "It's fine." "It's not fine. You'll get it infected." She walked over and took his hand before he could protest, examining the cut with a critical eye. "Do you have clean cloth?" He pointed to a shelf. She found what she needed and set about cleaning the wound with a competence that surprised him. Her touch was gentle but sure, no hesitation. "You've done this before," he said. "I helped in a hospital in Street Louis. Before I left." She wrapped his hand carefully, tying off the bandage. "There, keep it clean." Their eyes met, and for a moment neither of them moved. She was close enough that he could see flecks of blue in her grey eyes, could smell lavender soap faintly under the wood smoke. He pulled his hand away. "Thank you," he said gruffly. "You're welcome." That night he gave her his bed and slept by the fire. She protested, but he insisted. A man had standards, even a hermit. He lay awake, listening to her breathe on the other side of the deer-hide curtain, aware of every small sound she made. The cabin felt different with her in it, smaller, fuller, like something had shifted in the air itself. He didn't sleep well. The next morning brought more snow. They were trapped together, and Ezra felt the walls of his carefully constructed solitude beginning to crack. Claire made breakfast without asking. She'd watched him the day before and replicated his routine. The coffee was stronger than he made it. Better. The cornmeal mush had honey in it from a jar she'd produced from her satchel. "You don't have to do that," he said. "I know, but I'm not going to sit idle while you work." She looked at him directly, that steady gaze he was beginning to recognize. "I pull my weight, Mr. McCade. Always have." "Ezra," he said before he could stop himself. "Just Ezra. Ezra." She smiled, and something in his chest tightened uncomfortably. This was a mistake. Having her here was a mistake. The sooner the storm passed and he could get her back to town, the better. But the snow kept falling. By evening of the second day, they'd settled into an uneasy routine. She cooked, he chopped wood, and tended to necessary repairs. They ate together in silence. Then she read while he whittled or mended equipment. It was almost domestic, and that terrified him more than any blizzard. On the third night, as they sat by the fire, she spoke. "You're not as mean as you pretend to be." He looked up from the trap he was working on. "What?" "The town talks about you, the ghost of the peaks, the hermit who hates everyone." She set her book down. "But you're not cruel. You're just hurt. You don't know anything about me. I know you gave me your bed. I know you're patient, even though you clearly want me gone. I know your hands are gentle when you're not trying to be rough." She paused. "I know those initials on your knife mean something." Ezra set down the trap carefully, fighting the urge to tell her to mind her own business. But something in her eyes stopped him. Not pity, not curiosity, something else. Understanding, maybe. "She was my fiancée," he heard himself say. "Anna, we were supposed to be married 17 years ago. She died of fever 3 days before the wedding. I'm sorry. That's why I'm up here. That's why I stay alone." He looked at her directly. "And that's why you need to understand, when this storm passes, you leave. I help people because it's the right thing to do, not because I want company." Claire nodded slowly. "I understand." But something in her expression suggested she understood more than he wanted her to. The storm broke the next morning. The sun came out brilliant and cold, turning the snow to diamonds. Ezra packed supplies while Claire gathered her things. Neither of them spoke much. He should have felt relieved. Instead, he felt something else, something he refused to name. They set out for her wagon at mid-morning, walking in single file through snow that came up to their knees in places. Ezra led, breaking trail. Claire followed without complaint, keeping pace better than he'd expected. They found the wagon right where she'd said it would be, half buried in snow, the broken axle clearly visible. Ezra examined it and shook his head. "Can't fix this here. We'll have to take what we can carry and come back with tools." They loaded her belongings into packs, clothes, a few books, some personal items, practical things. But as Claire reached for a wooden box in the back of the wagon, Ezra noticed her hands trembling. "What is it?" he asked. "My mother's things," she said quietly. "All I have left of her." Something in her voice made him look at her more carefully. She was holding herself together, but barely. Whatever had driven her to these mountains, whatever she was running from it, had cost her. "We'll get it all," he said. "I promise." She looked at him with such gratitude that he had to look away. They made it back to the cabin by nightfall, exhausted. One more night, Ezra told himself. Tomorrow he'd take her to town, and this would be over. His life would go back to normal, back to the way it should be. But that night, as they sat by the fire one last time, Claire spoke words that would echo in his mind for days to come. "Thank you, Ezra, for your kindness, for seeing me as a person, not just a problem to solve." She paused. "You're a good man, whether you want to admit it or not." He didn't answer. Couldn't answer, because somewhere in the past 3 days, something had shifted, and he was terrified of what it might mean. By the time Ezra got back to the boarding house, his resolve had weakened. What was he going to say? That he'd changed his mind about being alone? That 3 days with her had undone 15 years of careful isolation? It sounded ridiculous, even in his own head. He found Mrs. Calloway in the kitchen, kneading bread dough with practiced efficiency. "Mr. McCade," she said, looking up with barely concealed surprise. "I thought you'd be halfway up the mountain by now. I need to talk to Claire." Mrs. Calloway's hands stilled. "She's at the schoolhouse. Went to meet with Mrs. Patterson about the teaching position." She studied his face. "You planning to tell her something important?" "Maybe. I don't know." "Well, you'd better figure it out." She wiped her hands on her apron. "That girl has been through enough uncertainty. Don't go stirring up feelings you're not prepared to honor." "I'm not—" He stopped. "I wouldn't hurt her. Not on purpose, no. But a man who doesn't know his own mind can hurt someone just as bad." Her voice softened. "I've known you a long time, Ezra. You're a good man underneath all that armor. But you've got to decide what you want before you go disrupting someone else's life." He nodded slowly. She was right. He couldn't just act on impulse, not when it came to Claire. "I'll wait," he said. "Think things through." "That's wise." Mrs. Calloway went back to her kneading. "The harvest dance is tomorrow night. Maybe you should come. See how you feel in a social setting before you make any declarations." The thought of the harvest dance made Ezra's skin crawl. Crowds, music, people trying to make conversation, everything he'd been avoiding for 15 years. But Claire would be there. "Maybe," he said, non-committal. He spent the rest of the day in town, which felt strange and uncomfortable. He wasn't used to having nowhere to be, no work to occupy his hands. He wandered to Carson's, checked on supplies he didn't need, sat in the saloon nursing a single beer for 2 hours, watched the sun track across the sky and wondered what he was doing. Late afternoon, he saw her. Claire was walking down the main street with a group of children, laughing at something one of them had said. She looked at home here, natural. The children clearly adored her, clustering around her like she was someone precious. Thomas Brennan was there too, Ezra noticed, walking beside her, smiling, saying something that made her laugh again. Ezra felt that dark twist in his gut return. He had no claim on her, no right to be jealous. She could walk with whomever she pleased. But knowing that didn't make it any easier to watch. That evening Mrs. Calloway cornered him again. "The dance starts at 7 tomorrow. I expect you to be there by 8 at the latest." "I didn't say I was coming. You didn't say you weren't." She gave him a knowing look. "Besides, I already mentioned to Claire that you might attend." Ezra wanted to be annoyed at the manipulation, but he couldn't quite manage it. "You're a meddling woman, Mrs. Calloway. Someone has to meddle in your life, Mr. McCade. Lord knows you won't do it yourself." He almost smiled. That night, alone in his room above the livery, Ezra did something he hadn't done in years. He found himself whittling, his hands moving of their own accord as his mind wandered. When he looked down, he'd carved a small bird. Delicate wings, careful detail. He'd made one like this for Anna, years ago. Never gave it to her because he'd wanted it to be perfect, and before he could finish it the way he wanted, she was gone. He'd kept it all these years, wrapped in cloth, a reminder of things left unfinished. This one was different. Rougher, maybe, but honest. The work of a man whose hands remembered how to create something gentle. He set it on the windowsill and stared at it for a long time. The next day passed in a blur of nervous energy Ezra didn't know how to process. He got a haircut from the barber, which raised eyebrows, got a shave, which raised more. By evening, he'd cleaned up better than he had in years, and he felt ridiculous for it. "You look almost civilized," the barber said with a grin. "Don't get used to it." But when he looked at himself in the mirror, he saw something different. Not the mountain hermit. Someone older, yes, more weathered, but not dead inside. Not quite. The dance was being held in the church meeting hall, already full of people by the time Ezra arrived. Music spilled out into the street, a fiddle, a guitar, someone on a makeshift drum. The sound made his chest tight with something like panic. He almost turned around. But then he saw Claire through the window, and his feet kept moving forward. She wore a simple blue dress, her dark hair loose around her shoulders. She was dancing with Thomas, smiling at something he'd said, and Ezra felt simultaneously drawn to her and terrified of that pull. He stepped inside. The music was louder here, the room warm with bodies and laughter. People noticed him. Immediately the hermit had come down from his mountain. Conversations paused, eyes tracked him. Mrs. Calloway appeared at his elbow. "Glad you made it. There's Punch over there, and—" "I see her," Ezra said quietly. Then, "Go talk to her." But he couldn't move. Stood there like a fool, watching Claire dance with other men, watching her laugh and blend into this community in a way he never could. The song ended. Thomas was leading her toward the punch bowl when she saw Ezra. Her face lit up, there was no other word for it, and she excused herself from Thomas, walking straight toward him. "You came," she said, slightly breathless from dancing. "Mrs. Calloway is very persuasive." "She is." Claire's smile was warm, genuine. "I'm glad, though. I didn't think I'd see you again." "Why not?" "Because men like you don't come to harvest dances." Her grey eyes studied his face. "What changed?" "Everything," he wanted to say. "You changed everything." But the words stuck in his throat, too big and too frightening to speak aloud. "Thought I'd see what all the fuss was about," he said instead, which was possibly the most cowardly thing he'd ever done. If Claire was disappointed, she didn't show it. "Well, since you're here, would you dance with me?" His heart hammered. "I'm not much of a dancer." "Neither am I, really. We'll figure it out together." She held out her hand, and after a moment's hesitation, he took it. The fiddle started up again, something slow and sweet. Claire led him to the floor, and he put one hand on her waist, held her other hand in his. They moved together, awkward at first, then finding a rhythm. "See?" she said softly. "Not so terrible." Being this close to her was terrible and wonderful all at once. He could smell lavender in her hair, could feel the warmth of her through the fabric of her dress, could see the flecks of blue in her grey eyes that he'd noticed before. "Claire," he started, not knowing what he was going to say. "Yes? I need to tell you something." She waited, patient and open in a way that made his chest ache. But before he could find the words, someone tapped his shoulder. Thomas Brennan stood there, polite and apologetic. "Mind if I cut in?" promised Mrs. Patterson. "I'd dance with Claire at least once more tonight." Ezra wanted to say, yes, he did mind, wanted to tell Thomas to find his own dancing partner. But Claire was already stepping back, giving Ezra an apologetic smile. "We'll talk later?" she asked. He nodded, mute and frustrated. He watched them dance, watched Thomas make her laugh, watched other men take their turns, each one a reminder of what he wasn't, what he couldn't give her. By 10 o'clock, he couldn't take it anymore. He slipped out of the hall into the cool night air, needing space to breathe and think. He was standing on the porch when he heard footsteps behind him. "Running away?" Claire asked softly. "Taking some air." She came to stand beside him, looking out at the dark shapes of the mountains against the stars. "It's beautiful out here, quieter than inside. You should go back in. People will miss you. Let them." She turned to face him. "You said you needed to tell me something." This was it. The moment where he either spoke the truth or stayed silent and let her slip away into the life she was building here. Ezra took a breath and finally told her about Anna. "I told you about her," Ezra said, keeping his eyes on the mountains. Easier to speak when he wasn't looking at Claire. "Anna, my fiancée. But I didn't tell you everything." Claire waited, still and patient beside him. "We grew up together, her and me. Same town, same church. I loved her from the time I was 14 years old." The words came slow, pulled from somewhere deep. "When I asked her to marry me, it was the happiest day of my life. She said yes, and everything felt possible. The night air was cold against his face, but he barely felt it. I was a trapper even then. Good money in it, enough to build us a life. But I needed one more season to save enough for the house I wanted to give her, so I left 2 months before the wedding. Headed up into these mountains for what was supposed to be 6 weeks. He stopped, the memory sharp as broken glass. I came back to find her grave. She'd gotten sick a week after I left. Fever. The doctor tried everything, but..." His voice cracked. "She died 3 days before our wedding, while I was up in the mountains, trapping beaver and thinking about our future. She was dying, alone. Ezra, I should have been there. If I'd stayed, maybe I could have done something. Maybe she wouldn't have..." He couldn't finish. Claire's hand found his in the darkness. "You couldn't have known. That's what everyone said. The whole town tried to tell me it wasn't my fault." He looked at her finally, seeing the compassion in her eyes. "But I chose to leave her, chose money and pride over staying by her side. That was my fault, Claire. My choice. So you punished yourself by leaving everyone and everything behind?" "I couldn't stay. Couldn't walk past the house we were supposed to live in, couldn't see her parents' faces, couldn't bear people's pity." He pulled his hand away gently. "Up in the mountains, there's no one to disappoint, no one to fail, no one to lose, and no one to love," Claire said quietly. "That's the price I chose to pay." They stood in silence for a long moment. Inside, the fiddle played on, muffled laughter drifting out through the windows. "Do you know what I think?" Claire asked finally. "What?" "I think Anna wouldn't want this for you." She turned to face him fully. "I think she'd be heartbroken to know you've spent 15 years punishing yourself for something that wasn't your fault. You didn't know her. But I know love. Real love wants the beloved to be happy, to live fully, even when we're gone." Her voice was gentle but firm. She wouldn't want you to stop living because she had to. Ezra felt something crack open in his chest, painful and necessary. "I don't know how to do this, don't know how to care about someone again. What if you lose them?" Claire finished. "What if they die, or leave, or stop loving you? What if it all goes wrong?" She stepped closer. "Those are the risks we take, Ezra. That's what it means to be alive." "I'm afraid," he admitted, the words barely a whisper. "So am I." Her eyes shone in the lamplight from the windows. "I'm terrified. I left everything I knew, came out here with nothing but hope and stubbornness. I don't know what I'm doing, or if I'm making the right choices. But I'd rather be scared and alive than safe and empty." He wanted to pull her close, wanted to kiss her right there on the boarding house porch and damn the consequences. But fear held him back, old and familiar as an iron chain. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked. "Because you need to hear it," she smiled sadly. "And because I'm hoping you'll choose to be brave, choose to try. Choose." She stopped, seemed to reconsider her words. "Choose to live. Before he could respond, the door opened and Thomas Brennan stepped out. "There you are, Claire. Mrs. Patterson's been looking for you. Something about the teaching position." He noticed Ezra, nodded politely. "McCade, Brennan." Claire glanced between them, then back at Ezra. "We'll talk more tomorrow." "Yeah, tomorrow." She gave his hand one last squeeze, then followed Thomas back inside. Ezra stayed on the porch, his mind churning. Everything she'd said made sense, but sense and courage were two different things. He'd been alone so long, he didn't know if he remembered how to be anything else. He walked back to the livery, retrieved the wooden bird he'd carved, and stood in the lamplight examining it. Simple thing, imperfect, but made with care, with hands that remembered how to create something gentle. Tomorrow, he'd give it to Claire. Tomorrow, he'd find the words to tell her what he was starting to feel. Tomorrow, he'd try to be brave. But tonight, he sat in his small room and let himself imagine a different kind of future, one where he wasn't alone, one where he came down from the mountain not once a month but every day, one where he had someone to come home to. The thought terrified him. But it didn't send him running back up the mountain, which felt like progress. Morning came bright and cold. Ezra woke with the wooden bird clutched in his hand, having fallen asleep thinking about what he'd say to Claire. He tucked it in his pocket and headed to the boarding house, his heart hammering like he was about to face down a grizzly. Mrs. Calloway answered the door. "Mr. McCade, up early. Is Claire?" "She's at the schoolhouse. Started her first official day as teacher this morning." Mrs. Calloway's smile was knowing. "She'll be there until 3 o'clock. Ezra nodded, tried to hide his disappointment. "I'll come back then. Or you could wait. I've got coffee and breakfast if you're hungry." He should leave, should go about his business and come back later. But instead, he found himself accepting Mrs. Calloway's invitation, sitting at her kitchen table while she fussed over him like he was one of her boarders. "You care about her," Mrs. Calloway said. "It wasn't a question. I barely know her." "Sometimes that doesn't matter. Sometimes you just know." She poured him coffee. "My late husband and I met on a Tuesday. Were engaged by Friday, married the next month. Everyone said we were fools, that it wouldn't last. We had 42 years together before he passed. We're not." Ezra didn't know how to finish. "You're scared. That's natural. But don't let fear make your decisions for you, Mr. McCade. That's no way to live." He thought about that while he waited. Thought about Anna and the life they never got to have. Thought about the last 15 years of careful isolation. Thought about Claire's grey eyes and her steady voice saying, "Choose to live." At 3 o'clock, he walked to the schoolhouse. Claire was erasing the chalkboard, her back to the door. She turned when she heard his footsteps, surprise and pleasure crossing her face. "Ezra, I didn't expect you. Had something for you." He pulled the wooden bird from his pocket, suddenly feeling foolish. "It's not much, just something I made." She took it carefully, examining the delicate carving with reverent attention. "It's beautiful. I made one like it for Anna. Never got to give it to her." He met Claire's eyes. Seemed like maybe it was time to finish what I started. Different bird, different woman, but Claire looked up at him, understanding dawning in her expression. "I can't promise I'll be good at this," Ezra said, the words coming in a rush. "Can't promise I won't get scared and want to run back to my mountain. But if you're willing to be patient with a stubborn old hermit who doesn't know how to do any of this anymore." She kissed him. It was gentle and brief, but it felt like coming home after a long, cold journey. When she pulled back, she was smiling through tears. "I'll be patient," she whispered. "As long as you keep trying." "I'll try," he promised. "That's all I can do." And for now, for this moment, that was enough. For 2 days, Ezra let himself believe in the possibility of happiness. He stayed in town instead of returning to his mountain, spent his evenings walking with Claire after she finished teaching, learning how to talk to someone again, how to let someone in. It felt strange and wonderful and terrifying all at once. They talked about everything and nothing. She told him about her childhood in Street Louis, her mother's kindness, her father's rigid expectations. He told her about his early years trapping, about learning the mountains, about the life he'd built in solitude. They didn't talk much about the future that felt too fragile, too new, but it hung between them like a promise neither was quite ready to make. On the second evening, they sat on Mrs. Calloway's porch, watching the sun set over the mountains. Claire had her sketchbook out, drawing the changing light on the peaks. Ezra whittled a piece of pine, his hands busy while his mind wandered. "What are you making?" Claire asked. "Don't know yet. Hands just want to move." She smiled at that, understanding. They'd fallen into a comfortable silence, the kind where words weren't necessary, when Mrs. Calloway came out onto the porch. Her face was troubled. "Claire, dear, there's someone here to see you." "Mine soon." Claire looked up, curious. "Who?" "Says his name is Dalton. William Dalton." Mrs. Calloway's voice was careful. "He says he's come from Street Louis." The colour drained from Claire's face. The sketchbook slipped from her hands, and Ezra caught it before it hit the floor. "Claire," he asked quietly, "my father's man." Her voice was barely a whisper. "He found me." A man appeared in the doorway behind Mrs. Calloway, tall, well-dressed, with the weathered face of someone who'd spent considerable time outdoors despite his gentleman's clothes. His eyes were sharp and assessing. "Miss Hartwell," he said with a slight bow, "I apologize for the intrusion." Claire stood slowly, and Ezra rose with her, positioning himself slightly between her and the stranger. "Mr. Dalton, I didn't think, I hoped, that your father wouldn't send anyone after you." Dalton's expression was sympathetic but firm. "You know him better than that, miss. When you disappeared, he was beside himself. He was angry. I disobeyed him. He was terrified something had happened to you." Dalton glanced at Ezra, taking his measure. "May we speak privately?" "No," Claire said firmly. "Whatever you have to say, you can say in front of Ezra." Dalton nodded slowly. "Very well. Your father sent me to bring you home. He's prepared to forgive your indiscretion if you return willingly. And if I don't return willingly, then I have legal authority to bring you back by other means." He pulled a folded paper from his coat. "You're unmarried, under your father's guardianship by law. He has every right to determine where you live and with whom." Ezra felt cold rage building in his chest. "She's a grown woman. She can make her own choices." "Not according to the law, sir." Dalton's voice was respectful but unyielding. "I understand you've offered Miss Hartwell shelter, and I'm sure your intentions were honourable. But her father has rights that supersede any attachment she may have formed here." "Attachment?" Claire's voice shook with anger. "You mean my life, my choices, my freedom? I mean your duty to your family?" "Miss," Dalton's expression softened, "I've known you since you were a child, Claire. I watched you grow up. I don't want to do this the hard way, but I will if I must. Your father loves you. He wants what's best for you. He wants to control me. He wants to protect you. By forcing me to marry a man I don't love, by treating me like property." Claire's hands were shaking. "I won't go back, Mr. Dalton. I can't." Dalton sighed. "I'm staying at the hotel. I'll give you until tomorrow evening to consider, but understand I'm not leaving Cutter's Ridge without you." He nodded to Ezra. "Sir, Mrs. Calloway." Then he left, his boots heavy on the porch steps. Claire sank back into her chair, her face pale. Ezra knelt beside her, taking her cold hands in his. "He can't force you," he said. "He can. Legally, he absolutely can." Her voice was hollow. "My father has connections, money, lawyers. If I refuse to go, Dalton will have the sheriff put me on a train back to Street Louis, and once I'm there, my father will make sure I never leave again." Mrs. Calloway had been standing in the doorway, listening. "There must be something we can do." "What? I have no money of my own?" "No legal rights." Claire looked at Ezra with desperate eyes. "Unless I marry someone else. That's the only way a woman escapes her father's authority, by becoming her husband's responsibility instead." The words hung in the air between them. Thomas Brennan appeared on the porch, having heard the commotion. "What's happening?" Mrs. Calloway quickly explained. Thomas listened, his face growing grave. "I'll marry you," he said to Claire. "If that's what it takes to protect you from being taken against your will. Have Reverend Matthews perform the ceremony. By tomorrow you'll be legally my wife, and Dalton will have no claim." Ezra felt his chest constrict. Thomas was offering exactly what Claire needed: legal protection, respectability, immediate safety, everything Ezra couldn't give her. But Claire was shaking her head. "No, Thomas, that's kind of you, but I won't trade one prison for another. It wouldn't be a prison, wouldn't it?" Her voice was gentle but firm. "You'd be a good husband, I'm sure, kind and respectful, but you'd still be making decisions for me, still be my legal guardian in all but name. I didn't come all this way to escape one cage just to walk into another." Thomas looked stung but nodded. "I understand. The offer stands if you change your mind." He left, and Claire turned to Ezra. "I need to think. I need to be alone for a while." She went inside, and Ezra heard her footsteps on the stairs, the soft click of her door closing. Mrs. Calloway put a hand on his shoulder. "What are you going to do?" "I don't know." But that was a lie. He knew exactly what he should do. He should offer to marry her himself, should give her the legal protection she needed. It was the only real solution. But the thought terrified him. Marriage meant promises, commitment, risk. It meant giving someone the power to destroy you again. It meant opening himself up to all the pain he'd spent 15 years avoiding. He walked to the saloon in a daze, his mind churning. Inside, he found a dark corner and ordered whiskey, nursing it while he tried to think clearly. Thomas joined him after a while, ordering his own drink. They sat in silence for a long moment. "You love her," Thomas said finally. "I barely know her." "That's not what I asked." Ezra took a long drink. "Don't know if I remember how to love anyone, but you want to try." With her, he did. God help him, he did. In just a few days, Claire had become what? Hope, possibility, a reason to come down from the mountain and try being human again? "She deserves better than me," Ezra said quietly. "Maybe. But she doesn't want better. She wants you." Thomas sighed. "I meant what I said. I'd marry her to protect her. But it would be a marriage of convenience, nothing more. You could give her something real. Or I could fail her. Like I failed Anna. Anna died of fever. That wasn't your fault. I wasn't there. And you think being there would have changed anything? You think your presence would have cured the fever?" Thomas leaned forward. "Ezra, I lost my wife 5 years ago. Childbirth. I was right there holding her hand, and she still died. Sometimes we lose people no matter what we do. That's not failure, that's life." The words hit Ezra like a physical blow. He'd never known Thomas had been married, had lost someone too. "The question isn't whether you can protect her from everything bad that might happen," Thomas continued. "The question is whether you're willing to be there with her while she faces whatever comes. That's what love is, showing up, even when it's hard." Ezra sat with that for a long moment. Then he stood up, left money on the bar, and walked back to the boarding house. He found Claire in her room, sitting by the window with her sketchbook open but untouched. She looked up when he knocked. "Can I come in?" She nodded, and he stepped inside, leaving the door open for propriety's sake. Mrs. Calloway was downstairs. She'd hear if anything improper happened, not that Ezra had any such intentions. "I've been thinking," he said. "So have I." Claire's voice was tired. "I'll leave tonight, head west, try to lose Dalton in the mountains. It's the only way. You'll die out there. Winter's coming, and you don't know the trails. Then I'll die free." The words were like a knife to his chest. "That's not a solution. It's the only one I have." She looked at him with red-rimmed eyes. "Unless you have a better idea?" This was it. The moment where he either stepped forward or let her go. The moment where he chose safety or chose to live. He thought about Anna, lying in her grave these 15 years. He thought about the wooden bird he'd never given her, the life they'd never lived. He thought about Claire's words on the porch. "She wouldn't want you to stop living." He thought about the locket in his pocket and knew what he had to do. "Marry me," Ezra said. Claire's eyes widened. "What? Marry me? Not for convenience, not for legal protection, though that too, but because in the past week you've made me feel alive for the first time in 15 years. Because you're brave and stubborn, and you see past all the walls I've built." He took her hands. "Because when I think about you leaving, it feels like losing Anna all over again. And I can't. I won't choose to lose you without fighting for you first." "Ezra, I'm terrified," he admitted. "I'm scared I'll fail you. Scared I don't know how to be what you need. Scared that loving you will hurt more than I can bear. But I'm more scared of living the rest of my life wondering what might have been if I'd been brave enough to try." Tears streamed down Claire's face. "Are you sure?" "No. But I'm choosing you anyway." He smiled slightly. "Choose loneliness or choose you. That's what you said that first day, wasn't it, in your mind?" "Something like that." "Then I choose you, Claire Hartwell, if you'll have me." She pulled him close and kissed him, and this time it wasn't gentle or brief. It was the kiss of two people who'd both been alone too long, who'd both been running from pain, who'd both found something worth being brave for. When they finally pulled apart, Claire was smiling through her tears. "Yes," she whispered, "I'll marry you." And Ezra McCade, who'd spent 15 years convinced he'd never love again, felt something long dormant stir in his chest. Hope. They told Mrs. Calloway first, and the woman's eyes filled with tears of joy. "Finally," she said, pulling them both into an embrace, "finally, you're choosing to live." Reverend Matthews agreed to perform the ceremony first thing in the morning. Unusual haste, but he understood the circumstances. Word spread quickly through the small town. By evening, half of Cutter's Ridge knew that the hermit was getting married. Ezra spent the night at Thomas Brennan's ranch. It felt wrong somehow to stay under the same roof as Claire on the night before their wedding, even in separate rooms. Some traditions ran deep. Thomas poured them both whiskey in his sitting room, a fire crackling in the hearth. "You're doing the right thing," Thomas said. "Am I?" Ezra stared into his glass. "I proposed to save her from Dalton. That's not exactly a foundation for marriage." "You proposed because you love her. Dalton just gave you the push you needed." Thomas took a drink. "I'll admit, I'm disappointed. I thought maybe Claire and I, but she never looked at me the way she looks at you. I'm sorry." "Don't be. She deserves someone who looks at her the same way back." Thomas smiled slightly. "You do, you know. Look at her like she's the only thing in the world worth seeing." Ezra didn't deny it. They talked late into the night about marriage, about loss, about the courage it took to love again after grief. Thomas had been where Ezra was, had loved and lost, and eventually found the strength to hope again, only to lose his second wife in childbirth. Yet he was still willing to try. "The pain of losing them doesn't go away," Thomas said quietly. "But the joy of having loved them that stays too. You have to decide which one matters more." By the time Ezra fell asleep in Thomas's guest room, he was more certain than he'd been in hours. Claire was worth the risk. She'd always been worth the risk. Morning came cold and bright. Ezra dressed in the only good clothes he owned, a shirt he'd bought years ago and never worn, pressed trousers, his father's vest that he'd kept all these years. He looked at himself in the mirror and barely recognized the man staring back. Not the hermit, not the ghost of the peaks. Someone else, someone ready to try again. Thomas clapped him on the shoulder. "You ready?" "No. But I'm going anyway." They rode into town together. The church was already filling with people. Mrs. Calloway had been busy. The whole town seemed to have turned out for this strange, sudden wedding between the hermit and the schoolteacher. Ezra waited at the front of the church, his hands shaking slightly. Reverend Matthews stood beside him, Bible in hand, expression kind and knowing. "Nervous?" the Reverend asked. "Terrified. That's normal. Marriage is terrifying and wonderful, often both at the same time." Then the doors opened and Claire walked in. She wore a simple white dress, Mrs. Calloway's, altered to fit, and carried wildflowers someone had picked despite the late season. Her dark hair was loose around her shoulders, and her grey eyes were bright with emotion. She was the most beautiful thing Ezra had ever seen. He met her halfway down the aisle, couldn't wait, couldn't stand still, and took her hands in his. "You came," he whispered. "Of course I came." She smiled, though tears threatened. "I choose you too, remember?" They walked together to the front of the church, and Reverend Matthews began the ceremony. Ezra barely heard the words. He was too focused on Claire, on the reality of this moment, on the fact that he was actually doing this. "Do you, Ezra James McCade, take Claire Marie Hartwell to be your lawfully wedded wife?" He looked into Claire's eyes and saw his future there. "Uncertain, yes. Scary, absolutely, but worth fighting for. I do." "And do you, Claire Marie Hartwell, take Ezra James McCade to be your lawfully wedded husband?" "I do." "Then by the power vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Ezra, you may kiss your bride." He did, and it felt like a promise and a beginning all at once. The church erupted in applause, but Ezra barely heard it. He was too busy holding on to Claire, anchoring himself in this moment, this choice, this leap into the unknown. They signed the marriage certificate, legal proof that Claire was no longer under her father's authority. Mrs. Calloway cried. Thomas shook Ezra's hand with genuine warmth. People lined up to offer congratulations, most of them looking slightly stunned that the hermit had actually gone through with it. Then William Dalton appeared in the doorway. The celebration quieted. Ezra felt Claire tense beside him, but he squeezed her hand, a silent reminder that she wasn't alone anymore. Dalton walked slowly up the aisle, his face unreadable. He stopped in front of them and pulled out the legal papers he'd shown Claire the night before. "I'm afraid these are no longer valid," Dalton said quietly. He tore them in half, then handed the pieces to Claire. "Mrs. McCade." Claire exhaled shakily. "Mr. Dalton, I'll return to Street Louis and inform your father that you've married. He won't be pleased, but there's nothing to be done about it now. The law is clear." He looked at Ezra. "Take care of her, Mr. McCade. She's braver than most men I know, but everyone needs someone to stand with them." "I know," Ezra said, "and I will." Dalton nodded, then turned and left the church. The door closing behind him sounded like the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. Mrs. Calloway had organized a small reception at the boarding house. There was food and drink and music, and for a few hours Ezra let himself be part of it. Let himself accept congratulations and well wishes. Let himself stand beside Claire and accept that this was real. But as evening fell, reality began to set in. He and Claire were married. They'd tied their lives together in the space of a few hours, driven by urgency and emotion. Now they had to figure out what that actually meant. They walked back to Mrs. Calloway's together, the streets quiet in the growing dark. Tomorrow, Ezra would bring Claire up to his cabin, their cabin now, but tonight, Mrs. Calloway had offered them her best room. At the door, Ezra paused. "Are you having second thoughts?" Claire asked gently. "Yes, and third and fourth thoughts." He looked at her. "But I'm not running. I promised you I'd try, and I meant it. That's all I ask. Just keep trying." She took his hand. "We'll figure this out together." That night, Lying beside Claire in the darkness, Ezra pulled the locket from his pocket. He'd carried it through the wedding, unable to let it go entirely. "What's that?" Claire asked softly. "Anna's locket. I've carried it for 15 years. He opened it, showing her the faded photograph. "I need to let it go, but I don't know how." Claire took it gently, examining the photograph in the moonlight from the window. She was beautiful. She was. Tell me about her. Not how she died, how she lived. So Ezra did. He told Claire about Anna's laugh, about the way she'd loved flowers and singing and had dreams of having a garden that would put everyone else's to shame. He told her about the plans they'd made, the future they'd imagined, and as he talked, something shifted. The memories became less painful, more precious. Anna stopped being a ghost haunting him and became what she'd always been, a woman he'd loved, who deserved to be remembered with joy, not just grief. "She sounds wonderful," Claire said when he finished. "She was, and she'd have liked you, I think. You're both stubborn as mules." Claire smiled. "I'll take that as a compliment." "It is." Ezra closed the locket. "Tomorrow, I want to take you somewhere, before we go up to the cabin." "Where?" "You'll see." The next morning dawned clear and cold. After breakfast, Ezra led Claire to the small cemetery on the edge of town. They stopped at Anna's grave under the cottonwood tree. Claire hung back, giving him space, but Ezra reached for her hand and pulled her forward. "Anna," he said to the stone, feeling foolish but needing to do this. "This is Claire, my wife. I think you'd understand why I love her. She's brave like you were, strong, stubborn." He paused. "I'm sorry it took me so long to move forward, but I'm trying now, and I wanted you to know that I haven't forgotten you. Never will. You'll always be part of my story." He pulled the wooden bird from his pocket, the one he'd carved for Anna years ago and never given her. He set it gently on the grave. "This was supposed to be for you. But I made a new one for Claire. She has hers, and now you have yours." He straightened. "Thank you for loving me when we were young, and for the memories I'll carry always." The wind moved through the cottonwood leaves, gentle and constant, like a benediction. Claire squeezed his hand, and together they walked away from the grave, not forgetting, but moving forward, carrying the past, but not living in it. Back at the boarding house, they gathered their things. Claire had her satchel and a few new possessions she'd acquired during her time in town. Ezra had supplies packed on his mule, everything they needed to start their new life together. Mrs. Calloway hugged them both fiercely. "You come down to visit, you hear? Don't go disappearing into those mountains and forgetting about us." "We won't," Claire promised. Thomas was there too, having brought 2 of his best horses as a wedding gift. "You'll need good mounts if you're going to travel between the cabin and town regular. And something tells me Claire will want to come down for her teaching sometimes." "You're keeping my position open?" Claire asked, surprised. "Of course. You're good at it, and the children adore you. Come down twice a week if you can manage it. The mountain life suits you, but you've got gifts to share with this town too." It was more than Ezra had expected, more than he'd dared hope for. A life that wasn't just isolation or just civilization, but something in between, something that honored both who he'd become and who he wanted to be. They set out at mid-morning, riding side by side up the trail toward the mountains. The path was familiar to Ezra, but everything felt different now. He wasn't running away from something. He was moving toward something, toward a future, toward hope, toward Claire. They stopped at the overlook where the town disappeared from view and the mountains opened up before them. Claire's breath caught at the beauty of it. "This is incredible," she whispered. "Wait until you see the cabin, the valley, the stars at night." He smiled at her. Our home, she repeated, testing the words. Then she looked at him, her grey eyes serious. "Ezra, I know this is hard for you. I know you're scared, but I want you to know I see you. Not the hermit, not the ghost of the peaks. You, and I'm not going anywhere." "I know," he said. "That's what scares me most." She laughed, and the sound echoed across the valley. "Then let's be scared together." They rode on, climbing higher into the mountains, toward the cabin where Ezra had lived alone for so long. But he wasn't alone anymore. And as terrifying as that was, it was also the most right thing he'd felt in 15 years. The sun was setting by the time they reached the cabin. Smoke rose from the chimney Ezra had come up yesterday to prepare, to light the fire and make sure everything was ready. He helped Claire down from her horse and led her to the door. Then he paused. "This isn't much," he said. "It's small and plain and far from anything. If you hate it, we can build something new, or—" "Ezra." Claire put her hand on his cheek. "Show me our home." He opened the door, and they stepped inside together. The cabin was warm from the fire, simple but clean. Claire walked around slowly, taking in the sparse furniture, the stone fireplace, the shelves of supplies. She went to the window and looked out at the valley, the mountains, the endless sky. "It's perfect," she said, and somehow, with her standing there, it was. Ezra's hand instinctively moved toward his knife, but Dalton held up both hands, showing he meant no harm. "I'm not here to cause trouble," Dalton said. "In fact, I may be able to help." Ezra studied him warily. "I sent a letter to Mr. Hartwell after the wedding, told him I'd witnessed the marriage, and that Claire entered into it willingly, with sound mind and clear intention." Dalton gestured toward the hotel. "Can we talk inside? What I have to say isn't for the whole town to hear." They went up to Dalton's room, a simple space with a bed and a desk. Dalton poured 2 glasses of whiskey and handed one to Ezra. "Mr. Hartwell sent me here to retrieve his daughter," Dalton began. "And I would have done it. I've served the Hartwell family for 30 years, watched Claire grow from a baby into the woman she is now. I've always done what her father asked. But I also watched her mother, watched what happened when a strong woman gets trapped in a life she didn't choose." Dalton took a drink. Claire's mother was like her daughter, spirited, intelligent, full of life. Mr. Duck Hartwell loved her in his way. But he loved controlling her more. Over the years I watched that light dim, watched her become a shadow of who she'd been. Ezra listened, understanding dawning. When Mrs. Hartwell died, Claire was heartbroken. But there was also relief in her eyes, I think. Relief that her mother was finally free. Dalton set down his glass. "I won't let the same thing happen to Claire. Won't help her father cage her the way he caged her mother. So why are you here? Why that letter about the annulment?" "I didn't write that letter. Mr. Hartwell did, but he asked me to deliver it. I refused." Dalton smiled slightly. "That's why I'm no longer in his employ." "Then who—" "He sent someone else, a man named Garrett, one of his lawyers, ruthless and completely loyal to Mr. Hartwell. If I know Garrett, he's already on his way here with documents and probably a federal marshal who owes the Hartwell family a favor." Ezra's chest tightened. "When? Could be any day now. The weather will slow them, but not stop them." Dalton leaned forward. "That's why I stayed, to warn you. To tell you that when they come, you need to be ready to fight legally, I mean. Get testimonies from people in town. Get your marriage certificate witnessed and certified. Build a case that Claire chose this marriage freely. We already have a letter we're sending to her father. It won't matter. He's beyond reason on this." Dalton stood and went to his saddlebag, pulling out a thick envelope. "This is everything I know about Mr. System Marner. Hartwell's legal strategy, the lawyers he's using, the arguments they'll make. I also included a letter of my own sworn testimony that I witnessed Claire's state of mind before and after the wedding, that she was clear-headed and determined, acting of her own free will." Ezra took the envelope, stunned. "Why are you doing this?" "Because I knew her mother. Because I care about Claire. and because I've spent 30 years watching powerful men control women under the guise of protection." Dalton's expression was fierce. "No more. Not if I can help it." They talked for another hour, Dalton explaining what to expect, how to prepare. Then Ezra rode back up the mountain, his mind racing. Claire met him at the door, her face anxious. "What happened? You've been gone for hours." He told her everything about Dalton, about Garrett, about the coming confrontation. Her face went pale, but her jaw set with determination. "Then we prepare. We gather our evidence, and we fight." Over the next 3 days, they built their case. Ezra rode down to Cutter's Ridge daily, collecting sworn statements from Mrs. Calloway, from Thomas, from Reverend Matthews. The sheriff, a man named Hastings, who'd always been fair, added his own testimony that Claire had shown no signs of distress or coercion. Claire wrote her own statement, clear and detailed, explaining her decision to leave Street Louis, her choice to stay in Cutter's Ridge, her reasons for marrying Ezra. Every word was deliberate, honest, powerful. By the time Garrett arrived with his federal marshal, they were ready. The confrontation happened in the church, which served as the town's courthouse when needed. Garrett was a thin man with sharp eyes and an expensive suit, looking out of place in the rough frontier town. The marshal was older, weary-looking, clearly uncomfortable with his role. "Mrs. McCade," Garrett began, his voice smooth and practiced. "Your father has instructed me to inform you that he's filed for annulment of your marriage on grounds of diminished capacity and undue influence. He's prepared to offer your husband substantial compensation if you'll return home voluntarily." "No," Claire said clearly, "I won't." "Then we'll have to pursue this through the courts. The marshal here has authority to take you into protective custody until the matter is resolved." "I don't think so," Sheriff Hastings said, stepping forward. "Not in my town. Not without proper evidence." What followed was a tense back and forth as Garrett presented his case, claims that Claire had been traumatized, manipulated, taken advantage of in a vulnerable state. He made Ezra sound like a predator who'd seduced a confused young woman. Then Dalton stood up. "I was there," he said quietly. "I was sent by Mr. Hartwell to retrieve Claire. I watched her for days before the wedding. She was clear-headed, determined, and absolutely certain of her choice." He looked at Garrett. "And I've sworn testimony to that effect. Signed and witnessed." Garrett's composure cracked slightly. "You were fired. I resigned. There's a difference." Dalton turned to the marshal. "I've known Claire Hartwell, Claire McCade, since she was born. I watched her grow up. And I'm telling you under oath that she made this choice with full awareness and sound judgment." Mrs. Calloway stood next, then Thomas, then Reverend Matthews, each one adding their testimony, painting a picture of Claire as a strong, independent woman making her own choices. Finally, Claire herself stood. "My father is a good man in many ways," she said, "but he's also controlling. He believes he knows what's best for me better than I know myself. He wanted me to marry a man of his choosing, live a life of his design. I refused because I knew it would destroy me, the way it destroyed my mother." Her voice grew stronger. "I came west to find freedom. I found something better. I found someone who sees me as an equal, who respects my choices, who loves me enough to be terrified of losing me but does it anyway. Ezra didn't manipulate me. He gave me what my father never did, the right to choose my own life." She looked at Garrett. "Tell my father that I love him. Tell him I hope someday he'll understand. But tell him I'm not coming back. This is where I belong. This is who I choose to be with. And no law, no court, no amount of money will change that." The room was silent. The marshal cleared his throat. "Ma'am, I have to ask, are you being coerced in any way to say these things?" "No." "Are you afraid of your husband?" "Only afraid of losing him." The marshal looked at Garrett. "I've heard enough. This woman is clearly acting of her own free will. I won't be taking her into custody." Garrett's face reddened. The law protects people from genuine harm. The marshal interrupted. "I don't see any harm here. Just a woman making her own choices." He stood. "My report will state that Mrs. McCade is mentally sound, acting voluntarily, and in no need of protection from her husband." He walked out, and Garrett had no choice but to follow. The church erupted in cheers. People surrounded Ezra and Claire, offering congratulations and support. But Ezra only had eyes for his wife, who was crying and laughing at the same time. "It's over," she said, falling into his arms. "It's really over. It's over," he agreed. They'd won. Not just the legal battle, but something bigger. They'd claimed their right to choose each other, to build the life they wanted, together. Spring came to the mountains with a gentleness that felt like grace. Ezra stood outside their cabin, watching the first green shoots push through the last patches of snow. 5 months had passed since the confrontation in town. 5 months of building a life together, learning each other's rhythms, becoming not just husband and wife, but partners. Behind him, he heard Claire's footsteps. She came up beside him, slipping her hand into his. They'd developed this habit over the winter, standing together in the early morning light, watching the valley wake up. "The flowers will be beautiful this year," Claire said. "I was thinking maybe we could plant a garden. Your mother had one, didn't she?" Ezra nodded. He'd told Claire about his childhood over the long winter nights, stories he hadn't shared with anyone in decades. She did. Roses, mostly. And vegetables. Said a person should grow at least some of their own food. Wise woman. She was. He paused. "Anna wanted a garden too. We talked about it, what we'd plant." Claire squeezed his hand. He'd learned he could talk about Anna without it destroying him, could remember her with fondness instead of just grief. Claire had given him the freedom to hold his past and his present both, without one diminishing the other. "Then we'll plant one for all 3 of you," Claire said. "Your mother, Anna, and me, a garden full of hope." They'd been making changes to the cabin all winter. Claire had sewn curtains from fabric Mrs. Calloway had given her. Ezra had built a second room, still small, but giving them more space. Her sketches hung on the walls now, alongside his father's rifle and the knife with the initials. The cabin felt lived in, loved in. News from Street Lewis had come in February, a letter from Dalton, who'd settled in Denver. Claire's father had finally accepted the marriage, though he'd made it clear he considered Claire dead to him. It hurt, Claire had admitted, but it was also freeing. She'd chosen her life, and now she had to live with the consequences. She was. They both were. The sound of horses made them both turn. 2 riders were coming up the trail, Thomas Brennan and Mrs. Calloway, unlikely traveling companions but increasingly common visitors. "Morning," Thomas called out, dismounting. "Thought we'd check on you too before the trails get too muddy." Mrs. Calloway climbed down with Thomas's help, carrying a basket. "Brought you some supplies, and news from town." They gathered around the rough table Ezra had built the previous month, bigger than his old one, meant for company. Claire poured coffee, while Mrs. Calloway unpacked the basket. "The children miss you," Mrs. Calloway said to Claire. "Mrs. Patterson's doing her best, but she's not you." "I miss them too," Claire admitted. "I've been thinking once the trail's clear, maybe I could come down twice a week again. Teach in the mornings, come back up in the evenings." "You'd be welcome," Thomas said. "Town's not the same without you." He looked at Ezra. "Either of you, actually. People ask about you, Ezra, want to know how you're doing up here." Ezra shifted uncomfortably. He'd been down to town more in the past 5 months than in the previous 5 years, but it still felt strange, being part of a community again. "We're doing well," he said simply. "We can see that." Mrs. Calloway's smile was warm. "You both look happy, healthy, like you belong together." They did. Ezra knew that now without question. The fear he'd carried for so long, that loving someone would destroy him, had proven unfounded. Yes, it was scary. Yes, he still had moments where the old panic rose up, but Claire was patient, and he was learning. After Thomas and Mrs. Calloway left, promising to return in a month, Ezra and Claire walked down to the clearing where they'd decided to plant the garden. The soil was good here, and there was plenty of sun. "We'll need seeds," Claire said, already planning. "And I want to sketch the layout first, decide what goes where." Ezra watched her pace the clearing, her hands moving as she described her vision. She was so alive, so present. Nothing like the desperate woman who'd appeared at his camp last autumn. She'd found her footing, found her strength. They both had. That evening, as they sat by the fire, Claire sketching, while Ezra whittled a new handle for an axe, she spoke without looking up from her drawing. "I got a letter from my father." Dalton forwarded it. Ezra's hands stilled. "And? He wants to know if I'm pregnant yet. Says it's his right as a grandfather to be informed." She looked up, her expression wry. "I think it's as close to acceptance as we're going to get." "Are you?" "Pregnant, I mean." "Not yet, but maybe someday." She set down her sketchbook. "Would you want that?" Ezra thought about it. 6 months ago, the idea would have terrified him. But now, imagining Claire with a child, their child, he felt something else. Hope. Possibility. "Yeah," he said quietly. "Someday. When we're ready." She came and sat beside him, resting her head on his shoulder. "We've built something good here, haven't we?" "We have. I'm glad I got lost that day. Glad my wagon broke down. Glad I stumbled into your camp and refused to leave. I'm glad you're stubborn as a mule." She laughed, and he kissed the top of her head. Outside, the sun was setting over the mountains, painting the snow-capped peaks gold and pink. Inside, the fire crackled, and two people who'd both been running from pain sat together in peace. Ezra thought about that morning last fall when Claire had first appeared. Thought about the choice she'd forced him to make, loneliness or love, safety or risk, death in life, or life with all its terrifying possibilities. He'd chosen her, chosen life, chosen to be brave, and every day since, he'd chosen her again. Some men choose loneliness because it's easier than risking their heart. Ezra McCade had been one of those men. But Claire McCade now had shown him a different path. Not an easy one, but a true one. A path forward. Together. In the drawer where he'd once kept Anna's locket, there was now a different treasure. Claire's first sketch of him, the one she'd drawn on Mrs. Calloway's porch. In it, he looked gentle, hopeful, like a man who still believed in possibilities. He'd become that man, or maybe he'd always been that man, just buried under 15 years of grief and fear. Either way, he was here now, present, alive, loved, and that, he thought as he held his wife close, was more than enough. It was everything.